So the US policy towards Ukraine has essentially turned on a dime in the past couple of weeks. Last week we heard about Donald Trump having a phone call with Vladimir Putin, setting up the peace talks. Those talks began in earnest in Saudi Arabia with no Ukrainian involvement. Since then, we've had Donald Trump essentially sounding off about Volodymyr Zelensky, calling him all kinds of names, suggesting he's a dictator, suggesting he's an illegitimate ruler, and even that Ukraine started the war. Tom, is Trump suffering from Zelensky derangement syndrome, perhaps?
I mean, it has been striking how in the past, certainly 24, 48 hours, he's very much kind of taking his lead from that section of Trump world, that section of the American right, which has become anti-Ukraine to a kind of cartoonish, conspiratorial degree. Things like he hasn't said this directly, but the kind of idea that Zelensky is basically kind of on the take, that he's this sort of welfare queen of global affairs, this kind of misconception that what's happened with US military aid is that almost like pallets of cash are showing up in Kiev, and Zelensky's pocketing half of it goes to some other dodgy oligarch and they carry on. It's absurd, but that's one thing that's been doing the rounds. This sort of thing his son says on social media, that's been there for a while. This idea that Zelensky's a dictator because of the fact that it's actually quite difficult to hold an election during a war, which has been doing the rounds, unfortunately. And I think as soon as we saw that delegation in Riyadh, where you had the Americans suddenly raising the issue alongside the Russians of the need for elections in Ukraine, was a bit of a tell that that particular kind of Russian point that they've been pressing for some time, that pointing to the fact that there hasn't been any elections, as if to paint Zelensky as some sort of illegitimate authoritarian, which coming from Putin's government is quite rich and also absurd for the reasons that we've talked about, has been part of this kind of attempt to slowly kind of delegitimize the regime, to suggest it doesn't have popular support, even though going by polls, it's still a fair amount of trust in Zelensky in that country. So it's I think everyone going into this knew where Trump and Trumpism and Trump world stood on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They did want to bring it to an end as soon as possible, but I think there was a hope that even within that there would be something resembling a decent deal, from at least from the starting point of right now. This was a situation in which it was being kind of fought, as many people would read it, it had been fought to a stalemate. Both sides of the conflict were certainly kind of running out of steam, were ending up with tremendous losses, and that maybe there was a point here in which, even though it wouldn't have been what supporters of Ukraine and people within Ukraine would have wanted, that some kind of fragile peace might be carved out. The fact that we're hearing him indulging in this kind of idea that not only that Ukraine isn't America's problem, which is something you've heard on the American right for some time, but that actually Ukraine and Zelensky in particular are the villain of the peace, surely isn't encouraging, to put it mildly, about how these talks are going to go from here on.
And Jacob, what do you make of this argument that essentially the whole few years of Ukraine's resistance has all been a big waste of time, big waste of money, big waste of lives, and that, well, in Trump's words, he should have cut a deal straight away. Do you go along with any of that? I mean, it seems extraordinary.
Well, the line people keep saying, we got to stop this pointless war. It's a pointless war that can't go on and mustn't continue, all the rest of it, which it seems very, very strange for people who, in the kind of Trumpist orbit, who seem to go on so much about the importance of defending our freedoms and defending our sovereignty and retaking our kind of, that they're very happy to wage a war against the internal elite that governed America, and they did so to great effect, and we all enjoyed Vance's speech. But they don't seem to appreciate that the fight for national self-determination is kind of is an equally, if not more important kind of principle that should be defended. And there's this sense in which you do want to sometimes make a distinction. It's Trump, right? He likes sounding off, and then something else happens, so you have to distinguish the rhetoric from the reality a little bit. But it does seem that in this instance, what's happened is that the rhetoric has kind of run away from itself. And the problem is in international politics is that things that you say suddenly become facts and realities very, very quickly. And there is one thing to say, and many people support it, and sure, lots of Ukrainians support, we need to find a peace, right? One thing to say that, and even say that Ukraine needs to make some concessions on the road to that. But then the demand for elections in Ukraine, I mean, I thought America and the Trumpist wing of MAGA movement was against global democracy promotion and saw the kind of problems that they'd gone into with that in the past. But now that's seemingly back because Zelensky refused to sign the minerals deal that Trump had put in front of him. And as I say, the problem in international politics is that you're in danger of setting off kind of realities that maybe Trump is not capable of meeting. And so the whole context in which this is happening, of American seeming kind of rethinking its strategic priorities of whether it wants to kind of support Europe or be the guarantor of European security as much as before, suddenly you're in a very, very different world when you start playing it fast and loose. And I would be, for example, I mean, the whole questions about the Baltics, about Poland, about Europe more generally are thrown open by this. And it's certainly, to put it kind of mildly, not very encouraging when you have an approach that seems to be worked out on the fly, seems to be reliant on this kind of shadiest corners of Twitter that Elon Musk's worked hard to amplify. Zelensky's line that Trump seems to be trapped in a little bit of a bubble of misinformation. I probably wouldn't have said that if I was Zelensky, but is probably true. It certainly seems true in this case in terms of the facts and figures that Trump relates to. But the fundamental point seems to be that without any the attachment to the principles you'd like to see as the basis for this, the importance of national self-determination, the commitment to democracy as a fragile achievement, all things that we know that at least J.D. Vance is capable of talking about in a kind of inspiring and stirring fashion. You'd want that to be much more at the heart of policy here. And that doesn't mean you have to just go off and then adopt a kind of emotional European Union style, we as big supporters of values policy, but you want American foreign policy, which is important to all of us, to still have a commitment to the ideas that they say they actually commit.
It seems to me that those sections of the kind of anti-Ukraine right make a kind of fundamental error insofar as there's all kinds of merits to, say, the arguments that were well had out over recent decades over the potential folly of, say, NATO expansion. You know, a point that we've on Spikes made many times, that the kind of reckless way in which Western foreign policy either antagonised Russia or gives it a pretext to do what it did almost 3 years ago now. That's not the full explanation, of course. I think there's a tendency to almost act as if Russia has zero agency whatsoever in this. But that's an entirely legitimate point to make. It does not follow on from that, first of all, that therefore, as soon as the tanks roll in, that you should just raise the white flag. It doesn't follow on from that Zelensky is some sort of sinister dictatorial figure. It doesn't follow on from that Ukraine should be treated with a degree. It's not just sort of disrespect. It's not almost vindictive to the things that are coming out at the moment. The grim spectacle of new kind of business ventures between the US and Russia being kind of discussed at the sidelines in Riyadh, as well as this reported sort of plan that's doing the rounds within the Trump administration, that a kind of cost would be imposed upon Ukraine that would be larger than that exacted from Germany for the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, this is only really makes sense if you spend a lot of time on those sections of X, as you describe, Jacob, where people are convinced not merely that Ukraine isn't America's problem, that this war has gone on for too long, that we need a peace at all costs, that America has bigger fish to fry, whatever, that it's actually something quite sinister is going on there with that government, and that they don't deserve solidarity, support, weapons, or anything else. Like, it just seems, because it's got so mangled into this very kind of crude, almost domestic political spat within the US, where it's kind of the current thing liberals on one side and the people who know the truth on the other, where Ukraine is concerned, that has now actually, at least where these comments are concerned, that whole atmosphere has intruded upon even these very serious negotiations to a degree that surely can't be good for Ukraine.
Definitely. And Jacob, one reason why all of this matters so much is because Europe can't step up to defend Ukraine. Europe has been asked to do that. The Trump administration wants to sort of rip off the Band-Aid, wants to cut Europe loose. They're saying we should get our act together. But we're simply not capable of doing it. That's why the US decisions have such an outsized influence. I mean, what have you made of America's comments towards Europe in that regard?
Yeah, well, people in Brussels kind of like to talk about wake-up calls. I've seen people refer to this as like, it's not wake-up calls is something you can keep silencing on your phone in the morning when you're a bit groggy, and that seems to be kind of what's going on here. But certainly the kind of strategic and geopolitical context in which this is happening is that for many decades, the question of what Europe's policy would be, does Europe want or need or is capable of an independent foreign policy? Does Europe have the kind of necessary economic and productive capabilities to create and sustain armies of the size that are needed in reality? All these questions have been allowed to be brushed under the carpet. People kind of looked at you like you're a wild-eyed loony if you're interested in military planning or army sizes, because that was also kind of passé, that belonged to a different era. And now we're in the era of the European Union and the peace that's kind of guaranteed by how nice we are to each other. And so this is a real, or ought to be, a real moment of recognition and realization for European countries and citizens right across Europe that we can no longer live in that kind of comfortable bubble, escaping from history. And in fact, something very profound and fundamental needs to change at the European level, in the sense of in every country right across Europe. And to that degree, that's why I say, like, on the one hand, you support some of the remarks of J.D. Vance, even if you think the Ukraine policy has slightly gone off the rails, whereby you need to say, fundamentally, this is the question of what does it mean to be patriotic? What does it mean to be a citizen of a country? And can we continue to sustain that kind of necessary attachment to our countries if, for example, our elites are so hostile to democracy, if they're obsessed on clamping down on everything that we say? And quite rightly, people begin to question their attachment to their country. So this ought to be a huge moment of shock to European elites. At the moment, though, it seems that certainly lots of the major ones are either mired in their own kind of navel gazing or keep repeating the lines that have been familiar to them of the past. And so you have to be slightly pessimistic about the possibility of Europe waking up at this moment.
And Tom, I did finally want to touch on the J.D. Vance speech a bit, because that was the other sort of rude awakening for Europeans, being told that, you know, people have noticed that you are anti-democratic. The world has noticed that you are turning against free speech. And obviously, you know, many of the European leaders have simply tried to deny that this is the case. But J.D. Vance had their number on that respect.
I thought it was fascinating that at the very same time that you had leaders in, say, Germany and Britain coming out to say this is absolute nonsense, of course, we don't clamp down on freedom of speech, you had a bloke being arrested for burning a Quran and raids going on in Germany for people posting things on the internet. I mean, this is it's almost
50 raids the weekend before.
Absurd. Like the level of gaslighting and dishonesty is tremendous. And I think it's also kind of telling that they don't even try to make a case for why we do things differently over here or what have you. I think people kind of recognise that a lot of the censorship which is going on at the moment in European countries, it's either nakedly politically motivated in some cases, trying to clamp down on kind of new populist insurgent movements, or it's a source of kind of shame. It's because of the fact that where an issue like Quran burnings exists, this has gotten completely away from governments. They haven't been able to get on top of this new kind of Islamist-style hysteria around these issues, and so would rather just kind of quietly censor people rather than deal with that fundamental problem. So he absolutely had their number. I just wish it didn't require a US vice president to make these points.
The two things are very actually related, the points made in Vance's speech and in a way the Ukraine issue, because there's a similar kind of deception going on both sides, where the European elites believe that what was going on in Ukraine was some kind of like something akin to the marches that they like funding in European capitals, where everybody's kind of engaged in some kind of kumbaya type politics. And similarly, American elites before the Trump administration believed that they were just kind of pulling the strings of a grateful Ukraine who was all going to be very happy for it. And Trump, in a way, has absorbed the same kind of self-importance that the Biden administration had towards Ukraine, thinks that there's no agency on behalf of the Ukrainian people. And both European elites are shocked to find out, for example, that Ukrainian nationalism is far more patriotic than they would be comfortable with. And Trumpists will be similarly surprised to find out that as difficult as the situation is in Ukraine, they're not going to take their fate lying down.
Definitely. Before we move on, though, I do just want to warn anyone who's in Germany, make sure, under no circumstances should you call the Green Party Vice-Chancellor a complete idiot. You must not call a Hamburg councillor a penis. And even an AfD politician managed to get someone fined for insulting them. So be careful, watch your words out there.
Please go out and do that.
Leave a comment and tell us.
We will help.
Leave it in the comment.
We will help crowdfund your defence.